This is the Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction Podcast, Episode 16, Getting the Dirt on Healthy Soil. I'm Extension's Todd Gleason. We're now joined by Andrew Margonaut. He's an assistant professor of soil science here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. Andrew, thank you for being with us. Can you first define for me soil health?
Soil health is a relatively new concept compared to other concepts in soil science. You can think of soil health in terms of where it came from. So the origins of soil health perhaps were really from the Dust Bowl. People talked about soil tilth as a way to mitigate the Dust Bowl erosion loss of soil. And then that got taken care of. So then we see this resurgence in soil quality in the 1980s. And that's more of building upon the concept of tilth is now quality in an effort to integrate chemical, physical, and biological aspects of soils. But that project was not really realized until the last decade or two with soil health. So the difference between soil quality versus soil health is a more explicit focus on the biology of soils. And we find this big emphasis on the microbes that make the cogs of the food chain work in soils.
So how do you make your soil health, soil tilth, better?
That is a good question, and one of ongoing scientific study. I think here we can learn a lot from what people know works. So what I mean by this is, what is the objective metric of a healthy soil? And it seems sort of obvious. The term itself is intuitive. We know, just like our bodies, what is a state of being unhealthy or maybe not so much. When it comes to actually parsing that out down to brass tacks, it gets a little bit more tricky. And this is because a lot of the phenomena or properties that we know are important for soil function, they're tough to compare. So it's sort of apples to bananas. For example, what is a pH of a healthy soil, and how does that get weighed against a biological property like microbial biomass carbon, or a physical one like soil aggregate stability? So these are qualitatively important, but integrating it can be tricky. That said, I think the utility of soil health is in that it makes people think about keeping roots in the ground to drive the soil food web, and second, not disturbing that process to the greatest extent possible. So to answer your question, what can we do to make soils healthy? Two things that we know definitely work, both scientifically and from what farmers are doing, is to minimize the disturbance of soils and to keep roots as long as possible. And that typically looks like, in our part of the world, cover cropping.
Can it do things to, for instance, reduce phosphorus loss?
Potentially. And my favorite answer that is ubiquitous in soil science is it depends. I think there's a lot of work that might need to be done to quantify under what circumstances can cover crops give us a double win of mitigating both nitrogen and P losses. There's reason to think that for cover crops, phosphorus losses might be lessened or perhaps exacerbated. And there's a lot of work to be done here on the species of the cover crop, as well as the timing of when it gets terminated and when there might be a window of vulnerability for phosphorus losses to happen. The reason for this is that there's lots of orthophosphorus contained in plant cells, so following the termination of that cover crop, there might be a flush of DRP in the runoff. So there's sort of this double-edged sword to consider about cover crops when it comes to phosphorus. On the whole, though, I think there's reason to expect that cover crops will likely provide benefits to phosphorus losses, or rather to mitigate those losses, largely done by their reduction of erosion.
Different subject matter a little bit. When there are large gullies or erosion, as you mentioned, in a field, are there things that producers can do and should do to create a better environment and to fix those problems?
Definitely. There's two ways to think about this. One is that you can treat the symptom and you can treat the problem. So the symptom is that there's this yawning gap in your field. And so that, of course, has to be addressed, or it should be, because the risk of gully erosion is that it feeds back on itself. So it's almost a feed-forward process. To circumvent that, the best approach is to fill it in. And there's lots of resources by the USDA, NRCS on what kind of fill Can you use topsoil? Can you use subsoil? The biggest thing would be to fill it, to try not to disturb it for that season. Now that can get tricky if there's a gully cutting across one's site. So that's the immediate treating that problem, stopping the bleeding, so to speak. Then there's also, I think, some thought that should be given to why is there gully erosion occurring on my field. It could have been a very bad year, a very wet year like what we're having right now. It could also be that perhaps the traffic is a little bit too much or the tillage a bit too intense in that part of the field. Are there things that could be done literally upslope of where that gully has emerged to mitigate the velocity and thus that erosional power of water going downslope? So there might be some simple things like a grass strip, and that can then prevent future gully erosion from happening, because though one might fill it in, if the practices or the conditions that lead to that happening don't get addressed, it's likely for that gully to reopen the next season.
What's your research about here?
Three main things. I'm a soil scientist, and I like to think that, soils provide a lot of services to human well-being. And the obvious one is we grow food, but we also grow fuel, like ethanol. We also grow fiber. We also do things with soils like build homes, both on it and with it, like bricks. So what my lab does is we try to understand how soils function to provide those services. More concretely, we work in three places or in three areas. One is how to manage phosphorus as the Goldilocks nutrient. So globally, we tend to have these scenarios of a little bit too much phosphorus, and then in some cases, a little bit too little. So on these twin aspects, we work in the Midwest and in developing nations in the tropics, East Africa, South America. A second pillar of what we do is looking at high-value perennial tropical crops. So here, our favorite crops of coffee and cacao. Things that we like to eat. They're grown by smallholder farmers globally in the tropical belt. And there's not much knowledge known about how to close yield gaps, but also quality gaps with these crops. And finally, we work in more fundamental biochemistry of soils. This gets at, in our applications, for example, looking at nutrient cycling, what makes those processes go forward. So we look at things like enzymes and microbes to understand the inner workings of soil function and soil health.
So that's soil health, soil tilt from the scientist's perspective, Andrew Margonotz. He, again, is an assistant professor of soil science here on the Urbana-Champaign campus of the University of Illinois. Adam Braun is a Fayette County farmer and a participant in the Tri-State Advanced Soil Health Training, which was presented by University of Illinois Extension. I asked him to tell us a little bit about his view of soil health, starting with, of course, his operation.
So we're a mid-sized farm, and we farm a good mix of upland ground and river bottom ground, raising corn, soybeans, and wheat. And we no-till quite a bit and try to increase our no-till acres every year. And I feel like, maybe our soil diversity has given us a bit of an extra challenge in trying to implement that as far as a one-size-fits-all system. So while we're not 100% no-till yet, we're striving for it, and we do no-till and minimum till about 95% of our acres, and have a goal to be 100% never-till sometime in the next 2 to 5 years. So we're working on that. We've been cover cropping for about 10 years, and we're just now to the point where we feel somewhat comfortable in cover cropping, a more sizable portion of our acres. And we'd like to increase the cover crop acres in the futures. And we, to the point we're at, we started with one species of cover crops, monocultures, and we're trying to move more into the direction of cover crop mixes.
Yeah, what do you do to improve your soil health?
So I think no-till and cover crops are both great steps towards improving soil health. They're important practices to improve soil aggregation, and that's just a fancy term to say basically the soil structure or the glue of the soil, which helps prevent the erosion and helps keep increasingly heavy farm equipment from making tracks and ruts through our fields. And it's important in allowing that water to enter the soil instead of running off down into the ditch. And the soil should actually function as a sponge and not a brick. And that's the point of soil aggregation. That extra water that the soil is soaked in during the spring rain events is a pretty big deal when you get farther along into the summer and you get into the dry season. Another thing, I firmly believe in a great starter system on our corn planter. So it's all about putting the nutrients where the corn plants can access them, and thereby improving our nutrient use efficiency. And it's enhanced our corn yields too, by the way. So how can you go wrong with that? I don't see a downside.
So have you seen less erosion damage in your fields since adopting the conservation practice?
Yeah, and I'd say that goes without saying. Seeing is believing to me. Because really one of my favorite things to do during an early spring rain event is to just drive around and look at the water that's running out of my fields. And you can tell by the color of it, which is clear, by the way. Now, and then you can compare it to neighboring fields that are, managed a little bit differently. The difference is usually pretty stark. When I compare that clear water running out of my fields to neighboring fields that are kind of muddy and dirty and very brown, at that point I know for certain that we have reduced erosion. And I'll be the first one to admit that, our water used to not be so clear. And not only that, I've seen improvement in the areas in the fields that have had chronic washouts. So we used to have to take tillage equipment around into those areas that were washed out, fill in the ditches, and then we'd do a tillage pass across the field, just to make everything uniform. And then that tillage pass would destroy our soil aggregation, and then it would wash away again during the next big rain event. So there we got caught in a vicious cycle. And the important thing is you have to identify that you are caught in that cycle and break it somehow. And that's what we did, and we're not going back.
Hey, what advice do you have for farmers thinking about adopting practices like you have, reduced tillage, no-till cover crops, improve fertilizer management in the lot?
The most important thing you can do at the start is improve the small things and strive to increase uniformity across all your acres. When you focus on uniformity, improving uniformity, the solutions to the problems that you encounter along the way seem to pop out. So I'm talking about like simple things, like making sure your combine straw chopper is distributing material evenly. It's an important first step in no-tilling the following year. So then find another small thing that improves uniformity and fix that. And pretty soon you'll have a farm uniform enough to be no-tilled and cover cropped. But keep an open mind through that transition and enjoy the opportunity to be creative, because that's what you're really doing, is you're really creating a system that works on your farm. And that system that you create will be different than what your neighbors do. And in fact, it's going to be very unique to your own farm. And that's the part that I really consider to be the fun part, because you get to enjoy the opportunity to differentiate your farm from the status quo and improve your bottom line along the way.
Adam Braun is a farmer from Vandalia, Illinois, and joined us on this Illinois Nutrient Loss Reduction podcast, episode number 16, Getting the Dirt on Healthy Soil. I'm University of Illinois Extension's Todd Gleason.